You're about to witness one of the most heartbreaking discoveries in American history, a revelation that would expose how an entire community conspired to hide a tragedy so devastating that its echoes still haunt the descendants of both victims and perpetrators. This is the true story of a veteran and his loyal German shepherd who discovered an ancient well on their property in rural Virginia, only to uncover evidence of a mass tragedy that had been deliberately erased from history for over 150 years. What started as a simple exploration of their new land would become a journey into America's darkest secrets, revealing truths that would forever change how we understand our nation's past. Before we descend into this extraordinary tale of discovery and heartbreak, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another incredible story of hidden history finally coming to light. Now let's follow the path that led to one of the most emotionally devastating discoveries ever made on American soil. The morning of September 3rd, 2023, began like every other morning since Thomas Riley had moved to the 127-acre property in Albemarle County, Virginia. The sun hadn't yet crested the Blue Ridge Mountains to the east, but the sky was lightening from black to deep purple, that magical hour when the world belongs to early risers and the creatures of dawn. Thomas stood on the wraparound porch of the 1820s farmhouse he'd purchased 6 months earlier, coffee steaming in his USMC mug, watching his German shepherd, Scout, perform his morning ritual of checking the property's perimeter. Scout was 6 years old, in his prime for a German shepherd, with the kind of intelligent eyes that seemed to understand human speech and the athletic build that came from daily 10-mile hikes through Virginia's rolling hills. He'd been partnered with Thomas through a veteran service dog program 3 years earlier, after Thomas's medical discharge from the Marines, following his 4th deployment to Afghanistan. The IED that had taken his left leg below the knee and left him with traumatic brain injury had ended his military career, but it had also brought Scout into his life. And Thomas often thought that was the only good thing to come from that day in Helmand Province when his world had exploded in fire and shrapnel. The property Thomas had bought was a revelation and a mystery wrapped into one. The listing had been vague. Historic 127-acre farm, Albemarle County, multiple structures, needs restoration, $275,000 cash only. And the seller, an estate liquidation company from Richmond, had seemed eager to close quickly. Thomas had used his disability settlement and savings to pay cash, drawn by the isolation, the history, and the challenge of restoration. After 23 years in the Marines, after losing not just his leg, but his identity as a warrior, he needed something to fight for, even if it was just fighting entropy and decay. The main house was a classic Virginia farmhouse, red brick with white columns, built by someone with pretensions to grandeur that the house never quite achieved. It had good bones, but needed everything. New roof, new plumbing, new electrical, new everything. The outbuildings were in various states of collapse. A massive barn from the 1850s that was one strong wind from becoming a pile of lumber. What had been slave quarters that made Thomas deeply uncomfortable every time he passed them. Various sheds and storage buildings being slowly consumed by Virginia creeper and kudzu. But it was the land itself that had sold Thomas on the property. 127 acres of rolling hills, hardwood forests, open meadows, and a year-round creek that formed the eastern boundary. It was diverse terrain that reminded him of the tactical training grounds at Quantico, with natural defensive positions, water sources, multiple escape routes, and sight lines that his combat-trained mind automatically catalogued and assessed. His therapist said his hypervigilance was a PTSD symptom that needed treatment. Thomas thought it was a survival skill that had kept him alive through 4 deployments, and saw no reason to abandon it now. Scout had adapted to the property immediately, as if he'd been born to patrol Virginia farmland rather than trained in a facility in North Carolina. Within days, he'd established his routes, identified the resident wildlife, deer, turkey, fox, the occasional black bear, and created a mental map that seemed more detailed than any survey. He'd also developed an obsession with certain areas of the property that Thomas hadn't yet explored, particularly a section of dense woods on the northern boundary that Thomas had been saving for cooler weather. That morning, Scout deviated from his usual pattern. Instead of his normal circuit around the house and barn, he headed directly north, toward those unexplored woods, moving with the purposeful gait that meant he'd detected something that required investigation. Thomas had learned to trust Scout's instincts absolutely. The dog had been trained to detect everything from IEDs to changes in Thomas's blood sugar that preceded his seizures, a fun leftover from the TBI. If Scout said something needed investigating, Thomas investigated. "Hold up, boy," Thomas called, downing the rest of his coffee and heading inside to gear up. Even for a morning walk on his own property, he prepared like he was going on patrol. Prosthetic leg checked and secure. Glock 19 in a chest holster. Virginia was a constitutional carry state, and Thomas had a concealed carry permit anyway. Fixed blade knife on his belt, small backpack with first aid kit, water, emergency supplies. Satellite phone because cell coverage was non-existent on most of the property. Hat, sunglasses, and his worn combat boots that had walked through Afghanistan's mountains and were now walking through Virginia's hills. Scout waited at the edge of the yard, his entire body pointing north like a living compass needle. When Thomas was ready, the dog led off immediately, not running, but moving with steady purpose through the tall grass of the meadow that separated the house from the northern woods. The September morning was perfect, cool but not cold, clear sky promising a warm afternoon, dew on the grass that would burn off within an hour. It was the kind of morning that made Thomas almost believe in peace, almost forget the nightmares that woke him most nights, almost ignore the phantom pain in his missing leg that no amount of medication could fully suppress. They entered the woods along what might once have been a road or substantial path, though it was now barely distinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. The trees here were old, much older than the second-growth forest that covered most of Virginia. These were giants, white oaks and chestnuts that had somehow survived the blight, their trunks so massive that 3 men holding hands couldn't encircle them. The canopy was so thick that the forest floor was relatively clear of undergrowth, creating a cathedral-like space with columns of wood instead of stone. Scout led them deeper into this ancient forest for about a mile, following the ghost of the old road. Then he suddenly veered left, off the path and into thicker undergrowth. Thomas followed, using a walking stick he'd cut from a fallen oak to help navigate the uneven ground. His prosthetic was high-tech military-grade equipment that had cost the VA more than most people's cars, but it still had limitations on rough terrain. After another few hundred yards of difficult progress through undergrowth that seemed deliberately hostile to human passage, the trees opened into a clearing about 50 feet across. It wasn't natural. Thomas could see the remains of a stone wall that had once enclosed the space, though most of it had collapsed and been overtaken by vegetation. In the center of the clearing was what looked like a small hill or mound, maybe 6 feet high and 15 feet across, covered in vegetation but too regular to be natural. Scout went directly to the mound and began circling it, nose to the ground, occasionally pawing at specific spots. His behavior was intense, focused, the way he acted when he'd found something significant. Thomas approached more slowly, his tactical mind automatically noting details. The stone wall had been substantial, probably 3 feet thick when intact. The clearing had been deliberately created and maintained for a long time before being abandoned. The mound was artificial, built rather than natural, and there was something about the geometry of the space that suggested purpose rather than randomness. As Thomas circled the mound, he noticed something that made him stop cold. Carved into one of the intact sections of the wall were symbols and what looked like text, though weathered beyond easy reading. He pulled out his phone to photograph them, though he had no signal to research them immediately. The symbols looked vaguely familiar, possibly Masonic or some other fraternal organization that had been popular in 19th century America. But it was what Scout found on the far side of the mound that changed everything. The dog was pawing insistently at a spot where the vegetation was thinner, whining in the back of his throat. Thomas knelt beside him, pulling away vines and leaf litter, revealing worked stone. Not rough fieldstone like the wall, but dressed granite, smooth and precisely fitted. As he cleared more debris, he realized he was looking at the rim of a well, or what had been a well, now covered with a massive granite slab that must have weighed several tons. The slab was carved with more symbols and what was clearly text, though in an old-style script that was hard to read. Thomas cleared it completely, photographing everything. The text was in English, though archaic. He could make out dates. 1871 was clear, and what looked like 1794. There were names, dozens of them, carved around the rim of the slab, and in the center, in larger letters that were still clearly legible despite the weathering, were the words, "Here lie the innocent. May God forgive us for what necessity demanded." Thomas sat back on his heels, mind racing, a sealed well hidden in the woods with what appeared to be a memorial or confession carved into its seal. Every instinct from his intelligence training was screaming that he'd found something significant, something that had been deliberately hidden. The dates suggested this was from the post-Civil War era, a time of massive upheaval in Virginia. The reference to the innocent and the plea for forgiveness suggested tragedy, possibly atrocity. Scout had moved to the edge of the clearing and was now standing alert, ears forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Thomas immediately went to tactical alert, hand moving to his weapon. Someone was coming, multiple someones, moving through the woods with more noise than skill. Thomas positioned himself behind the partial wall, Scout beside him, and waited. 4 men emerged from the woods, all appearing to be in their 60s or 70s, all wearing work clothes that suggested they were locals. They stopped at the edge of the clearing when they saw Thomas, their expressions shifting from surprise to something that looked like fear mixed with anger. "You shouldn't be here," the apparent leader said. He was a tall, lean man with the kind of weathered face that came from a lifetime of outdoor work. "This is private property." "It's my property," Thomas replied, not moving from his defensive position. "Bought it 6 months ago. All 127 acres, including this section." The men exchanged glances that spoke volumes. The leader stepped forward, hands raised in what was probably meant to be a calming gesture, but which Thomas read as potentially threatening. "Son, I'm Jim Crawford. My family's been in this county for over 200 years. That there," he gestured at the sealed well, "that's something that needs to stay buried. For everyone's sake. There's things in this county's history that are better left alone." "Sounds like you know what's down there," Thomas observed, noting how the men positioned themselves, unconsciously forming a semicircle that could quickly become an encirclement. "I know enough," Crawford said. "My great-great-grandfather was one of the men who sealed that well in 1871, left strict instructions that it was never to be opened, never to be disturbed. Every generation of my family has kept that promise, kept that secret. Now you need to keep it too." "Those secrets have a way of poisoning everything they touch," Thomas said. "In my experience, the truth, however painful, is always better than lies." Crawford's expression hardened. "You're not from here. You don't understand. This isn't about some family secret or local scandal. This is about something that could tear this entire county apart, could destroy families that have lived here since before the Revolution. Some truths are too heavy to bear." "Every truth can be borne," Thomas replied. "It's lies that break under their own weight." The confrontation might have escalated, but Scout chose that moment to demonstrate why military and police units around the world preferred German shepherds. He moved from passive alertness to active threat display, hackles raised, teeth bared, his 85 pounds of muscle coiled and ready. His growl was deep, primal, the sound of a predator warning rivals away from his territory. The men stepped back involuntarily. "We're leaving," Thomas said, not wanting the situation to escalate, but also not willing to be intimidated. "But this is my property, and I'll explore it as I see fit. If you have information about what's on my land, I'd appreciate you sharing it. If not, I'd appreciate you staying off my property unless invited." He and Scout withdrew carefully, tactically, never turning their backs on the men until they were well into the woods. He could feel their eyes on him, long after they were out of sight. This was no longer just about historical curiosity. 4 men didn't show up randomly in the deep woods on a Sunday morning, unless they were watching, waiting, protecting something. Back at the house, Thomas immediately began researching. The satellite internet was slow but functional, and he had access to military historical databases from his service. He started with the dates 1794 and 1871 and Albemarle County history. What he found made him sit back and reassess everything. In 1794, Albemarle County had been rocked by what historical records called a plague or disease outbreak that had killed scores of people, predominantly enslaved Africans on the surrounding plantations. The records were vague, contradictory, and seemed deliberately obscured. Some accounts mentioned quarantine, others mentioned violence, still others simply noted that many slaves had died and been buried in mass graves. But it was the 1871 date that proved more interesting. That was 6 years after the Civil War ended during Reconstruction, when federal troops still occupied much of Virginia. There were scattered references to unrest in Albemarle County, to federal intervention, to something that had been covered up by local authorities with the apparent cooperation of federal forces. One obscure academic paper mentioned rumors of a great shame that local families had sworn to keep secret. Thomas was deep in research when his motion sensors alerted him to vehicles approaching. He looked out to see 2 pickup trucks and a sheriff's department SUV coming up his long driveway. This was escalating quickly. The sheriff himself had come, a man Thomas recognized from his few trips to town, Sheriff Robert Dalton, whose family name appeared on half the historical markers in the county. He was accompanied by 2 deputies and, surprisingly, Jim Crawford, and 2 of the men from the morning's encounter. Thomas met them on the porch, Scout beside him. He was openly carrying now, the Glock visible in its holster, which was legal, but sent a message. Scout picked up on his tension and maintained a ready stance. "Mr. Riley," the sheriff said, his tone officially friendly, but his eyes hard. "Heard you had a bit of a misunderstanding with Jim here this morning." "No misunderstanding," Thomas replied. "I was exploring my property. Mr. Crawford and his friends were trespassing on my property. The only misunderstanding seems to be about property rights." The sheriff's jaw tightened. "Now, Mr. Riley, we try to be neighborly here in Albemarle County. Jim's family has been looking after that particular piece of woods for over 150 years. It's a historical site of sorts. Local families have an interest in preserving it." "Then they should have bought it," Thomas said flatly. "I paid cash for this property, have the deed free and clear. Every inch of it is mine, including whatever historical sites are on it. Now, unless you have a warrant or some legal basis for being here, I'd appreciate you leaving." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "You're a Marine, aren't you? Did some checking. 4 tours in Afghanistan, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts. Medical discharge after an IED. You're a hero, Mr. Riley. But being a hero doesn't mean you understand everything. This county has its ways, its traditions, its secrets. Some of them are better left alone. In my experience, Sheriff, secrets are usually kept to protect the guilty, not the innocent." The sheriff's expression darkened. "You have no idea what you're talking about, no idea what's at stake. He caught himself, glanced at Crawford. "There are things in this county's history that would destroy good families. Families that have done nothing but serve this community for generations. Is your curiosity worth that? The truth is always worth it, Thomas said. They left after more vague warnings and appeals to community solidarity that Thomas ignored. But he knew this was far from over. These people were scared, genuinely terrified of what was in that well, which made Thomas even more determined to find out what it was. He spent the next week preparing. He ordered specialized equipment, cameras that could be lowered into confined spaces, lights, air quality monitors, rope and pulley systems. He also reached out to contacts from his military service, including Marcus Webb, a fellow Marine who had become a historian specializing in African American history in the antebellum and Reconstruction South. Tom, what you're describing sounds like something related to the 1794 yellow fever outbreak, Marcus said over the phone. But there's something off about it. Yellow fever was devastating to white populations too, but the records from Albemarle County suggest it predominantly affected enslaved populations. That's not typical yellow fever behavior. What else could it be? Well, that's the thing. There are rumors, oral histories in the African American community about something else. Something deliberate, but nobody's ever found proof. If you've found something that might provide that proof, Tom, this could be huge and dangerous. These old Virginia families don't give up their secrets easily. Thomas hired a security company to install cameras around his property and upgraded his alarm system. Scout seemed to understand that they were under threat, becoming more vigilant, more protective. They continued their daily patrols, but now Thomas was always armed, always ready. He'd survived 4 tours in Afghanistan. He wasn't about to be intimidated by some Virginia good old boys protecting family secrets. On September 15th, with all his equipment ready, Thomas returned to the well. He'd chosen a Sunday again, correctly guessing that Crawford and his associates would be at church. Scout led the way, eager to return to the site that had captivated him. The clearing was unchanged, the sealed well waiting like a tomb. Moving the granite slab would normally require heavy equipment, but Thomas had come prepared with military engineering solutions. Using a combination of levers, pulleys, and pure physics, he was able to shift the slab enough to create an opening. The smell that emerged made both him and Scout retreat immediately, death and decay, somehow still potent after 150 years. Thomas let the well air out for an hour before approaching again with his gas detector. The readings showed low oxygen, but no immediately toxic gases. He set up his camera and light rig, essentially a GoPro on a cable with LED lights, and began lowering it into the darkness. The well was deep, at least 40 feet. The walls were expertly constructed stone, still intact despite the years, but it was what the camera revealed at the bottom that made Thomas's hands shake. Bones. Hundreds of skeletons, some still partially articulated, others scattered. And among the bones were other objects, chains, shackles, and what looked like personal effects. This wasn't just a mass grave, it was something else, something worse. He was so focused on the camera feed that he almost missed Scout's warning growl. By the time he looked up, he was surrounded, not just Crawford and his group, but at least a dozen men, all armed, all with the grim expressions of men about to do something they'd rather not, but felt they must. "Step away from the well, mister." "Riley," Crawford said, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. "Please, you don't understand what you're doing." "Then explain it to me," Thomas said, not moving, his hand near his weapon but not on it. Scout was in full defensive mode, positioning himself between Thomas and the nearest threat. Crawford looked at the other men, seemed to come to a decision. "All right. You want the truth? The whole ugly truth? Fine. But understand, once you know, you're part of it. You'll carry it like we do, like our fathers and grandfathers did." He sat on a section of the old wall, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. In 1794, there was no plague. There was a rebellion. The enslaved people on 5 plantations, including this one, coordinated an uprising. It was well planned, well executed. They killed the overseers, took weapons, declared their freedom. For 3 days, they held this area. Crawford paused, his voice becoming quieter. The plantation owners panicked. This was only 3 years after the Haitian Revolution started. They were terrified of the same thing happening here, so they made a decision. They couldn't defeat the rebels in open combat. The slaves outnumbered them and had defensive positions. So they pretended to negotiate, to offer terms. Thomas felt sick, knowing where this was going. Crawford continued, "They invited the rebels to gather here, at this well, which was the main water source for the area. Told them they'd discuss terms, maybe even grant freedom to some. Over 200 people came, men, women, children. The plantation owners had militia hidden in the woods. Once everyone was gathered, they opened fire. They murdered them," Thomas said flatly. "They murdered them," Crawford agreed. "All of them. Then they threw the bodies down the well and sealed it. Told the federal authorities that there had been a plague outbreak, that the slaves had to be buried quickly to prevent spread. Forged documents, bribed officials, covered the whole thing up. But that was 1794, Thomas said. The seal says 1871. Crawford's expression became even more pained. "That's the worst part. In 1871, during Reconstruction, a group of freed slaves who had heard the oral history of what really happened came looking for the well. They wanted to give their ancestors proper burial. The local families couldn't let that happen. It would have destroyed them, would have resulted in federal occupation, trials, executions maybe. So He stopped, unable to continue. One of the other men, younger than Crawford but still in his 60s, took up the tale. They killed them too. Another 17 people, threw them down the same well and resealed it. That's when they carved the stone you saw. Here lie the innocent. May God forgive us for what necessity demanded." "Oh, my great-great-grandfather carved those words. He killed himself a year later, couldn't live with what he'd done. If you're as horrified by this revelation as we were, please take a moment to like this video and share it so more people learn about these hidden chapters of American history that some would prefer to keep buried forever. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell, because what Thomas discovered next would change everything about how this story would unfold." Thomas stood slowly, his mind processing the horror of what he'd just heard. 2 massacres, 77 years apart, both covered up, both protecting the same lie. Over 200 people murdered and thrown down a well like garbage, their families never knowing what happened to them, their stories erased from history. "You've all known this," he said, looking at the assembled men. "All your families have known this for generations, and you've done nothing." "What could we do?" Crawford asked. "Destroy our families, our community? Bring shame and ruin on people who had nothing to do with the original crimes except being born into families that did?" "You could have told the truth," Thomas said. "You could have given those people dignity in death, if nothing else." "And we would have lost everything," another man said. "Our lands would have been seized, our families destroyed. For what? The dead would still be dead." Thomas looked at them with a mixture of pity and disgust. "You don't get it. The secret has already destroyed you. Look at yourselves. You're spending your Sunday mornings guarding a mass grave instead of living your lives. You're threatening a fellow veteran to protect a lie. The guilt has poisoned every generation of your families, whether you admit it or not." He pulled out his phone. "I've recorded everything you just said, video and audio. It's already uploaded to the cloud. If anything happens to me or Scout, it goes public immediately." The men looked stricken. Crawford stood, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip, then stopping. "You don't know what you've done." "I've brought truth to light," Thomas said. "Something that should have been done 150 years ago." "The descendants of those people," one man said desperately. "There are thousands of them in this county. If they find out, there will be violence, retribution, blood." "There will be justice," Thomas corrected. "Legal justice, historical acknowledgement, and maybe finally peace." He left them there, standing around the open well like mourners at a funeral that was a century and a half overdue. Scout stayed close, sensing his handler's emotional turmoil. Thomas was shaking by the time he reached his truck, not from fear, but from rage and sorrow combined. All those people, murdered twice over, forgotten, erased. It was evil on a scale that challenged comprehension. Back at the house, Thomas immediately contacted Marcus Webb and shared everything. The video, the photos from the well, the confession from Crawford. Marcus was silent for a long moment after reviewing it all. "Tom, this is massive. This isn't just a local crime. This is a systematic cover-up involving federal authorities, state officials, multiple generations of conspiracy. We need to handle this carefully. Let me contact some people at the Smithsonian, the National Museum of African American History, and we need legal protection for you immediately." Within 48 hours, Thomas's property was swarming with people: FBI agents, forensic anthropologists, historians, archaeologists. The well was carefully excavated under the supervision of Dr. Sarah Chen from the Smithsonian, who had experience with mass grave sites. What they found was even worse than the initial camera footage had suggested. 217 bodies in total. The victims from 1794 were at the bottom, many still in shackles, suggesting they had been thrown in alive. Personal effects, buttons, coins, jewelry, religious items helped identify some individuals. The 17 victims from 1871 were on top, and several were identified through early photographic records and missing persons reports that had been filed by family members and ignored by authorities. The story broke nationally on September 20th, 2023. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, everyone covered it. The Well of Sorrow, as the media dubbed it, became the most discussed story in America. The footage of bodies being carefully removed, of descendants who had heard family stories now confirmed, watching their ancestors finally being freed from their prison, was devastating. Thomas found himself at the center of a media storm he'd never wanted. Reporters camped outside his property. Death threats came from white supremacist groups who saw him as a race traitor. Support came from civil rights organizations who saw him as a hero. The attention was overwhelming for someone whose PTSD made him want to hide from the world. But it was the families of the victims who gave Thomas purpose through the chaos. They came by the hundreds once word spread. Many had oral histories, stories passed down through generations about ancestors who had disappeared in 1794 or 1871. Now they had answers, painful but necessary answers. One woman, Ethel Washington, 87 years old, came with a daguerreotype photograph from the 1860s. It showed a young man, serious-faced, dressed in his Sunday best. "This was my great-great-grandfather, Samuel Washington. He was one of the 17 killed in 1871. My family was told he'd run off, abandoned his wife and children. My great-great-grandmother died of a broken heart," they said, "but really she died of shame, thinking her husband had left her. Now I know he died trying to honor his ancestors, trying to give them dignity. He was a hero." The Crawford family and the other descendants of the perpetrators faced a reckoning they'd been avoiding for generations. Some fled the county entirely. Others, like Jim Crawford, chose to face it head-on. He held a press conference where he publicly acknowledged his family's role in both massacres, apologized to the descendants of victims, and announced he was donating his family's land, over 1,000 acres, to create a memorial and educational center. "My family has carried this sin for over 200 years, Crawford said, looking older than his years. "We thought we were protecting our community, but we were really protecting our guilt." Mr. Riley was right. The secret poisoned everything it touched. It's time for truth, for acknowledgement, for whatever healing is possible. Not everyone was ready for reconciliation. The county split into factions, those who supported full disclosure and those who wanted to minimize the damage. Some of the old families hired lawyers to prevent their ancestors' names from being released. Others hired public relations firms to manage the crisis. A few made threats that the FBI took seriously enough to provide Thomas with protection. The excavation of the well took months. Each body was carefully removed, photographed, documented. DNA samples were taken to help identify victims and connect them with living descendants. Personal effects were catalogued and preserved. The process was meticulous, respectful, treating each victim as an individual whose story deserved to be told. Dr. Chen's team made several significant discoveries. Many of the 1794 victims showed signs of violence beyond gunshot wounds, broken bones, skull fractures, suggesting they had been beaten before being shot. Some of the children were so young that their bones were barely formed. One woman had been pregnant. The 1871 victims included 3 women and 2 children who had apparently accompanied their fathers and husbands to search for the well. As the investigation expanded, more evidence emerged. Hidden in the attics and basements of old plantation houses, researchers found documents that had been thought destroyed. Letters discussing the 1794 rebellion and the decision to suppress it violently. Financial records showing that the plantation owners had collected insurance payments for their murdered slaves, claiming they had died of disease. Government documents showing that federal authorities in 1871 had been bribed to look the other way. Thomas struggled with the weight of what he'd uncovered. His PTSD, already severe, was exacerbated by the stress of constant attention and the emotional toll of the discoveries. Scout became even more essential, not just detecting Thomas's panic attacks, but providing the steady presence that kept him functional. There were days when the only reason Thomas got out of bed was because Scout needed to be fed and walked. Marcus Webb, who had taken leave from his university to help coordinate the historical research, became a frequent visitor. He helped Thomas understand the broader context of what they'd found. This wasn't an isolated incident, Marcus explained. Throughout the South, there were rebellions and uprisings that were suppressed and then erased from history. The victors write the history books, and the plantation owners were the victors. They created the narrative of happy slaves and benevolent masters, and they destroyed or hid any evidence to the contrary. But this is different, Thomas said. This is proof, undeniable, physical proof. Exactly. That's why it's so important. This well is evidence of systematic murder and cover-up that involved multiple levels of government over multiple generations. It's proof that the entire narrative of the Old South and Reconstruction is built on lies. The legal ramifications were complex. While the original perpetrators were long dead, the cover-up had continued into the modern era. Several prominent families were investigated for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The county government faced lawsuits from descendants of victims. The state of Virginia established a commission to investigate other potential sites of hidden violence. One unexpected consequence was a wave of similar discoveries across the South. Inspired by Thomas's discovery, people began investigating local legends and oral histories. 3 more mass graves were found in Virginia, 2 in North Carolina, 4 in Georgia. Each discovery added to the mounting evidence that violence against enslaved and freed African Americans had been far more widespread and systematic than official histories acknowledged. Thomas testified before Congress about his discovery, Scout beside him as always. The image of the wounded veteran with his service dog, telling the story of finding a mass grave on his own property, became iconic. He spoke simply and directly about the responsibility of uncovering truth, no matter how painful. "I didn't go looking for this," he told the Congressional Committee. "I was just exploring my property, but once I found it, I couldn't ignore it. Those people deserve to have their stories told. Their descendants deserve to know what happened. America deserves to know its real history, not the sanitized version we've been taught." The creation of a memorial at the site became a community project, though not without controversy. Some wanted a simple marker, others wanted an elaborate memorial. Thomas, as the property owner, had the final say, but he deferred to the descendants of the victims. They chose something powerful in its simplicity. The well itself was preserved under a glass dome, with the names of all identified victims carved in black granite surrounding it. An eternal flame burned for the unknown victims. The dedication ceremony, held on April 15, 2024, exactly 1 year after the first body was removed from the well, drew thousands. The president attended, delivering a speech about the importance of confronting difficult truths. Descendants of victims and perpetrators stood together, some reconciled, others still processing their pain and anger. Thomas spoke briefly, uncomfortably. Public speaking wasn't his strength, and the attention still made his PTSD symptoms worse. But he felt he owed it to the people in the well to bear witness to their story. "A year ago, Scout led me to this place," he said, his hand resting on his dog's head. "I thought I was just exploring my property. I had no idea I was about to uncover one of America's hidden atrocities. The 17 people who were murdered and thrown into this well were erased from history. Their families never knew what happened to them. Their stories were stolen along with their lives. Today, we restore their stories. We acknowledge their humanity. We promise that they will never be forgotten again." The memorial became a pilgrimage site. School groups came to learn about the real history of slavery and Reconstruction. Descendants came to honor their ancestors. Historians came to study the evidence. The site that had been hidden in the woods for over 150 years became one of the most visited historical sites in Virginia. But for Thomas, the discovery had taken its toll. The constant attention, the threats from extremists, the emotional weight of what he'd found. It all exacerbated his PTSD. He had more bad days than good, more nightmares than peaceful sleep. Scout worked overtime, alerting to panic attacks, providing deep pressure therapy during flashbacks, creating barriers between Thomas and crowds. 6 months after the memorial dedication, Thomas made a decision. He donated the property to the Smithsonian, with the stipulation that it be preserved as a historical site and research center. He kept only the farmhouse and 5 acres around it, enough for him and Scout to have privacy while still being guardians of the memorial. The Thomas Riley Center for Hidden History was established on the property, dedicated to investigating and documenting suppressed historical events. Researchers from around the world came to study not just the well, but the methodology of uncovering hidden history. The center's motto, suggested by Thomas, was simple: truth rises. As the 2nd anniversary of the discovery approached, Thomas reflected on how completely his life had changed. He'd come to rural Virginia seeking isolation and peace, a place to heal from the visible and invisible wounds of war. Instead, he'd found a responsibility he'd never wanted, but couldn't abandon: to be a witness to atrocity, a voice for the voiceless, a guardian of difficult truths. Scout was showing his age now, moving a bit slower, his muzzle graying. But he still performed his duties with dedication, still alerted Thomas to dangers both physical and psychological. The dog had become famous in his own right, receiving commendations from historical societies and veterans organizations for his role in the discovery. Someone had even started a children's book series about Scout the history dog, though Thomas found that a bit much. One evening, sitting on his porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Thomas was visited by Ethel Washington, the elderly woman whose great-great-grandfather had been murdered in 1871. She brought him a quilt her grandmother had made, featuring patterns that told the story of their family's journey from slavery to freedom. "This belongs with you," she said, despite Thomas's protests. "You gave my family our history back. You proved my great-great-grandfather was a hero, not a deserter. This quilt tells our story, and now you're part of that story." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people brought together by historical tragedy and modern courage. Scout lay between them, content in the peace of the moment. In the distance, they could see the eternal flame of the memorial, a point of light in the gathering darkness. "Do you regret finding it?" Ethel asked eventually. Thomas thought about it for a long moment. No, I regret that it existed to be found. I regret that those people suffered and died. I regret that it took 150 years for them to get justice, but I don't regret finding it. Truth matters, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts, Ethel corrected gently. As she left, Thomas remained on the porch, Scout beside him. The property that had seemed like a refuge had become a battlefield, then a memorial, and now something in between. He was its guardian, along with Scout, protecting not just the physical site but the memory of what had happened here. The well still stood under its glass dome, no longer hidden but preserved, a testament to the human capacity for both evil and redemption. The 217 people who had been thrown into it had finally been given dignity in death, their stories told, their humanity acknowledged. It wasn't justice. Justice would have been them living full lives in freedom, but it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that was all that was possible. Thomas knew that somewhere in America there were other wells, other mass graves, other erased stories waiting to be discovered. The Thomas Riley Center for Hidden History received reports weekly of potential sites, of family legends that might be true, of historical mysteries that needed investigation. Each one was carefully researched, some leading to new discoveries, others proving to be folklore. But each investigation was important, each story deserved to be examined. One morning, a year after establishing the center, Thomas received a package with no return address. Inside was an old leather journal and a note. My family has kept this for generations. It tells of another well, another massacre, this one in Kentucky in 1811. I'm too old and too afraid to pursue it, but you've shown courage I don't have. Please find them and give them peace. Thomas looked at Scout, who, despite his advancing age, was alert and interested. What do you think, boy? One more mission? Scout's tail wagged, his eyes bright with the intelligence that had led them to the first well. Thomas began reading the journal, already planning the expedition, knowing that this was his purpose now, to uncover the hidden, to voice the silenced, to bring light to darkness wherever it tried to hide. The work would never be finished. There would always be hidden history, suppressed truths, erased stories. But Thomas and Scout would continue as long as they could, following leads, investigating legends, uncovering evidence. They had become accidental historians, unexpected heroes in a battle against forgetting. Each discovery added another chapter to America's real history, the one that included all its people, all their stories, all their struggles and triumphs and tragedies. It was painful work, heartbreaking work, but necessary work. Democracy, Thomas had learned, required not just freedom, but memory, not just laws, but truth, not just justice, but acknowledgement. As he prepared for the Kentucky expedition, Thomas thought about the 217 people in the well. They had waited over 150 years for someone to find them, to tell their stories, to acknowledge their humanity. They had waited in darkness and silence, erased from history, but not from existence. Scout had found them, had refused to let Thomas walk past, had insisted on investigation. In that insistence was a lesson Thomas carried forward. Never walk past a mystery, never ignore an injustice, never let convenience override conscience. The Kentucky trip would be challenging. Thomas was older now, his prosthetic leg giving him more trouble, his PTSD still a daily battle despite years of therapy. Scout was older too, moving with the careful dignity of an aging warrior. But they would go, would investigate, would uncover whatever truth was waiting. It's what they did now. It's who they had become. The farmhouse in Virginia would wait for their return, watched over by the staff of the center. The memorial would continue to draw visitors. The eternal flame would keep burning. The stories of the 217 would continue to be told. But Thomas and Scout would be in Kentucky, following a lead, investigating a legend, possibly uncovering another hidden tragedy that deserved acknowledgement. This was their mission now, their purpose, their form of service. They had both been wounded in different wars. Thomas in Afghanistan, Scout in the war against forgetting, but they had found each other, had found their calling, had found a way to transform their trauma into purpose. Every hidden grave they uncovered, every suppressed story they revealed, every erased person they restored to history was a victory against the forces that would prefer America forget its sins. The journal from Kentucky was detailed, specific, credible. Another group of murdered innocents, another cover-up that had lasted centuries. Thomas made his preparations methodically. Equipment, contacts, legal protections, security measures. He'd learned from the Virginia experience that uncovering hidden history was dangerous, that there were always those who preferred lies to truth, silence to acknowledgement. Scout watched the preparations with interest, understanding that they were going on another mission. Despite his age, despite the grey in his muzzle and the stiffness in his joints, he was ready. He was a soldier still, a warrior against forgetting, a finder of the lost. Together, he and Thomas would continue their unexpected calling, their accidental destiny, their mission to ensure that America's hidden dead would hidden no more. The road to Kentucky stretched ahead, leading to another revelation, another reckoning, another chance to bring truth to light. Thomas loaded the truck carefully, Scout taking his familiar place in the passenger seat. They pulled out of the driveway as dawn broke over the Blue Ridge Mountains, heading toward another secret that had been kept too long, another group of people who deserved to have their stories told. Behind them, the memorial stood in the morning light, the glass dome over the well, catching the sun like a prism, breaking white light into all its component colors. The 217 souls who had been hidden in darkness were now remembered in light, their stories part of America's acknowledged history. It had taken 150 years and a chance discovery by a wounded veteran and his service dog, but truth had finally risen from the depths. Now Thomas and Scout were headed to help other truths rise, other stories emerge, other erased people reclaim their place in history. The mission that had begun with a morning walk on their property had become their life's work. They were seekers of the hidden, revealers of the suppressed, voices for those who had been silenced. And they would continue for as long as they were able, proving again and again that secrets could be kept for generations, but not forever, that lies could persist for centuries, but not eternally, that truth, however deeply buried, would always find a way to rise. This incredible true story reminds us that America's history is far deeper and darker than we've been taught, that entire communities of people were erased not just from life, but from memory, and that sometimes the most important discoveries come from simply following a dog's instincts. If this story moved you, please share it with others who need to know about these hidden chapters of our history. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell to join us for more extraordinary stories of hidden truths finally coming to light. Remember, beneath the ground we walk on every day may lie secrets that deserve to be revealed, stories that need to be told, and people who should never be forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this heartbreaking journey into one of America's most devastating hidden truths, and the veteran and dog who ensured that 217 souls would finally rest in acknowledged peace.